Greetings. I'm Barbara Wiggins. If you were living in Shakespeare's England, your entertainment wouldn't consist of watching a video in the comfort of your home as you are doing now.
And I'm Art Wiggins. No, you would be in a playhouse and a trumpet fanfare would announce the imminent start of a play.
There was no TV guide in those days, so you would have to look at the flags flying outside the playhouse to find out what was playing. A black flag meant tragedy, a white flag comedy, and a red flag stood for history.
May you live in interesting times is a combination blessing and curse that applies to Elizabethan England big time. Life was certainly interesting for the 4 million or so living on the Emerald Isle. Life expectancy was short. There were periodic bouts of the plague. There was threatened Spanish overthrows of the Queen, and there was an ongoing religious feud involving Catholics and Protestants. As distractions, ordinary people like most of us craved entertainments, so they celebrated at every opportunity. They played all manner of games, indoors and out, attended animal baitings, and went to see plays. Plays were not expensive and provided a social gathering place as well as a midday distraction, so they became extremely popular.
As of 1590, the plague was still an ugly fact of life. Queen Elizabeth had subdued but not solved the Catholic Protestant issue. The Spanish Armada was defeated in 1588, and the economy was booming. More than a dozen playhouses presented a play every day, 6 days a week, for about 7 months per year. This generated a huge demand for new plays. Histories were most popular, and playwrights mined a book called Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland by Raphael Holinshead for plots. Comedies and tragedies required playwrights to range further for sources, even using short stories or ones written in foreign languages.
Demand for new plays was so high that many playwrights worked together, and even inexperienced writers were pressed into service. Such was the good fortune for Will Shakespeare, and therefore all of us. Here's a view of a typical Elizabethan theater. Actors performed on a raised platform. Some of the audience watched from box seats, others sat on the stage itself, but the vast majority of them stood on the ground directly adjacent but slightly below the level of the players. They were called groundlings and were quick to express their reactions to a play, either positive or negative. If not cheering, they jeered or threw things at the performers like rotten pears and so forth. Since groundlings had to stand for 3 or more hours, their demand for entertainment was high. On the other hand, all plays had to be approved by the master of the revels so they wouldn't offend the queen. The result was that playwrights had to tread a fine line between entertaining and offending. To avoid annoying the queen, plays were often set in earlier times or foreign lands. To keep groundlings happy, there were plenty of bloodshed, and the villains were usually drawn from groups that were the objects of cultural bias.
The Spanish and French were England's traditional enemies anyway, and Spain's 130-ship armada sent to overthrow Queen Elizabeth was defeated in 1588, mostly due to mismanagement and bad weather. Besides, Spain was a Catholic country, so Elizabeth's extensive spy network kept watch on both Catholics and Spaniards to keep troubles to a minimum. The gypsies were often mislabeled as Egyptians and wandered about the countryside, told fortunes, danced, and entertained. Although popular, they were expelled by Acts of Parliament several times, but enforcement was sporadic. Moors were extremely rare in England and regarded as being ignorant, dull, and jealous. The Bible said Noah's son Ham was cursed to be, quote, black and loathsome. Parliament expelled all, another quote, Negroes and blackamoors in 1596 on the grounds that they were draining resources. Jews were victims of negative attitudes carried over from medieval times. They had been banned in England since 1290 and existed in only small secret groups in London. In much of Europe, Jews were forbidden to own property, run a business, or practice a trade. So many Jews turned to money lending to earn a living. Christian rules prohibited charging interest called usury, but Jewish law permitted usury when loaning to non-Jews. Italian cities such as Venice and Genoa had a thriving money lending trade, with Jews loaning to Christians. Last but not least, there's the elephant in the room: women. Cultural bias against women had been ingrained for hundreds of years. Women's inferior status had biblical roots. Think of Adam's rib. And it was carried through even in England's law of the land. Women were marginalized. They belonged to their fathers, their brothers, or husbands, and couldn't even own property on their own unless they were widowed. The ideal woman was characterized as submissive and obedient to her father or husband, simply bearing children, cooking, cleaning, and tending the home. Unmarried women were often spinsters, nuns, or harlots. The major exception that gave everybody pause was their unmarried Queen Elizabeth.
This is the milieu in which playwrights had to operate in 1580 to 1600 England. Most plays were bloodthirsty, male-dominated histories of bygone eras, set in distant land, or featured villains from the culturally biased list. Here are some popular plays from the era. The Spanish Tragedy by Thomas Kyd, written in 1585, was set in the royal courts of Spain and Portugal. This play featured many violent murders, a revenge-seeking ghost, and a play within a play. This is the first of the revenge plays. It was probably the most popular play of its time. Kit Marlowe's Tamburlaine the Great, written in 1587, took place in the Middle East and Africa. The writing was exceptional, but contained even more bloodshed than the Spanish Tragedy. Marlowe's Jew of Malta, written in 1590, featured a greedy Jewish moneylender who not only killed several contemporaries, but poisoned an entire nunnery that included his own daughter.
Then in 1595, after a 2-year hiatus due to plague, playhouses reopened. Play-starved Londoners swelled playhouse attendance, and playwrights were pressured to produce new plays quicker than ever. I think that could happen here now. Most playwrights responded with most of the same: histories, comedies, and tragedies, with villains from the usual suspects. But one particular playwright made a bold move. He wrote a play billed as a comedy set in Italy. On the surface, the play seemed like the usual fare. The villain was a Jewish moneylender, and he was cleverly outsmarted by a Christian. 3 marriages in the play justified the happily ever after demand of a comedy. Although some might expect it to be similar to Kit Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, it turned out to be to contain a radical departure. In 1596, the play came out called, and it was by Will Shakespeare, of course, The Merchant of Venice. Before we explore the differences, let's review the play to brush up your Shakespeare.
Bassanio, a poor nobleman in Venice, needed money to woo the beautiful heiress Portia. He asked his wealthy friend Antonio for a loan of 3,000 ducats, but Antonio's funds were invested in ships overseas. A Jewish moneylender, Shylock, offered the cash on the condition that he would take a pound of Antonio's flesh if the loan was not repaid within 3 months. Meanwhile, Shylock's daughter Jessica stole money from her father and eloped with a Christian. Bassanio fulfilled Portia's father's conditions and married her. However, Antonio's ships were lost, and he could not repay the loan when it came due. At Antonio's trial, Portia stepped in, disguised as a young male lawyer. She argued that the bond was indeed forfeit, but asked Shylock for mercy. Shylock refused because he wanted revenge for the way he was treated by Christians, especially Antonio. Then Portia pointed out that the bond does not allow 1 jot of blood. Shylock backed down and offered to accept his principle. But Portia told Shylock that all his goods were forfeit for seeking the life of a Venetian citizen, and his life himself was at the mercy of the Duke. The Duke pardoned him his life, but Antonio demanded that Shylock become a Christian and keep half his money, but they must forfeit that money upon the death to his daughter Jessica and her Christian husband. Shylock reluctantly agreed and left in disgrace. The final act involved the three newly married couples and a comic manipulation about their wedding rings. Here are a few factoids about the play.
In the 14th century story El Picarón, the woman is a greedy widow, and both she and the Jew are unnamed. The name Shylock is not particularly Jewish, although a somewhat similar name appears in Genesis. More directly, it is a Saxon word for white-haired and probably familiar to Londoners.
So white-haired is good.
I like it. 3,000 ducats is approximately equivalent to $320,000 in today's money. This play is the second most performed of Shakespeare's play, topped only by Hamlet.
Although The Merchant of Venice has some similarities to contemporary plays of the time, Shakespeare's treatment of women and Jews differs profoundly from Marlowe and Kidd.
Two women were definitely unconventional. Shylock's daughter's theft and elopement with a Christian represents a huge departure from normal behavior for Elizabethan women. Portia's obedience to her father's will is more typical, but then she dresses like a man and outsmarts all the men in the courtroom. Portia also happens to have more lines than anyone else in the play.
Right. The Jewish villain seems properly evil at first, but then a curious thing happens. Shylock says something very unvillain-like. He says, quote, "Hath not a Jew eyes?" Followed by 16 other points of similarity between Jews and Christians. And as if that's not enough, Shylock's concerns are shown to be even more than just the usual complaints of money and revenge. A friend of Antonio quotes Shylock's reaction to Jessica's disappearance. "My daughter, oh my ducats, oh my daughter, fled with a Christian, oh my Christian ducats."
As we often insist, Shakespeare's lines are best performed aloud. Please join us in speaking this play's most significant lines.
Shylock says, quote, "I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed by the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge?"
Portia says, "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his own crown." In this play, Shakespeare departs from other plays of the time by humanizing a villain. The shameful treatment of Shylock and Jessica's elopement with a Christian is no excuse for his demand of a pound of Antonio's flesh, but provides more human motivation than any other villains in the plays at the time usually get. Jessica's theft and elopement and Portia's superior intellect breaks the usual mode for women, but both of them pledge to be good, normal wives for the times. Thus, Shakespeare doesn't completely upend his stereotypes. Both Shylock and Portia will have some expected features, but their characters have been broadened. They are no longer one-dimensional, they are human.
So what larger conclusions can we draw from Shakespeare's bold treatment of usually one-dimensional characters in The Merchant of Venice?
Well, The Merchant of Venice, is it feminist? Well, no. Portia obeys her father's wishes and marries the man who opens the right casket. But yes, Jessica rebels against her father. Portia dresses like a man and outsmarts the Duke's entire court.
So is the play anti-Semitic? Yes. Shylock is a villain by demanding a pound of Antonio's flesh. But on the other hand, maybe not so much. Shylock argues his humanity eloquently.
Is it ambiguous? Yes. That is Shakespeare's game plan.
A spark of yin in a sea of yang. Discussions of the play's original writing is only a small part of the picture. Over the more than 400 years of the play's existence, it has been performed in different languages and cultures by many different directors and actors. Various directors choose to omit certain lines or whole scenes. Actors add body language to the roles, and music, costumes, or scenery modify the mood, changing the whole tenor of the play. In Shakespeare's time, the troupe's best actor, Richard Burbage, played Shylock. Not much later, the role was filled by a comic, followed by a stern villain. In the early 19th century, Shylock was treated more sympathetically. But in the 1930s, Shylock was rendered as pure evil in a German radio broadcast said to be Hitler's favorite. After the Holocaust, virtually all productions featured a sympathetic portrayal of Shylock by such renowned actors as Laurence Olivier, John Gielgud, Patrick Stewart, Justin Hoffman, and F. Murray Abraham, one of my favorites. A recent example is a 2004 movie that's a version with Al Pacino playing a powerfully sympathetic Shylock. Boy, is that wild.
Another question would be to ask if Shakespeare himself was anti-Semitic or pro-Semitic. After the expulsion of Jews from England in 1290, there were few Jews left, so it's unlikely Will knew any Jews personally. Yet there were plenty of non-Jewish moneylenders, perhaps including Will's own father. The 1571 Act Against Usury promised prosecution against charging more than 10% interest. But those charging less interest weren't necessarily going to be prosecuted.
Or persecuted either.
With capitalism on the rise, business startup money was sorely needed. So borrowing and lending were hot button topics. Since the Christian church frowned on usury, religion and business were on a collision course. It was easier to make Jews the scapegoats than to confront the fact that there were many Christian moneylenders.
In the absence of documentary evidence of Shakespeare's own thinking, scholars have subjected his poems, sonnets, and plays to intensive analysis, seeking connections to events in his life or his internal attitudes and beliefs, especially his feelings about Jews. In Shakespeare's writing, they claim to have found evidence of alternate authorship, homosexuality, religious tracts, multiple heterosexual liaisons, and even secret messages written in hard to decipher code. We have studied many of these treatments and found some very interesting, but not compelling. In short, we find no satisfactory answer to Will Shakespeare's attitude about Jews. We just don't know.
A related question, perhaps more tractable, is what was Shakespeare's motivation for humanizing his characters by revealing multiple aspects of their personalities? Shakespeare gives us a clue in Hamlet's instruction to the players in the play within a play. He says, the purpose of playing is to hold the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her own feature, scorn her own image. Clearly, he is aware of his own technique. Here are some other examples of Shakespeare's humanizing his characters. Also in Hamlet, although Hamlet treated Ophelia badly, Hamlet jumps into her grave with her brother Laertes and tussles with him, saying, I loved Ophelia. 40,000 brothers could not, with all their quantity of love, make up my sum. In Macbeth, Lady Macbeth tries to get rid of the blood of the murdered King Duncan, and says, here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. In Othello, just before he kills Desdemona, He tells her to pray. I would not kill thy unprepared spirit. No, heaven forfend. I would not kill thy soul. So what possible motivations did Will Shakespeare have for these humanizing treatments?
Boy, there's a big question. So was it his deep understanding of people? That doesn't seem quite evident by his abrupt departure from his young family in Stratford at age 21, but perhaps his insights might have developed in London.
The brilliant rabbi who married us, Sherwin Wine, was convinced that Shakespeare was a humanist and was simply acknowledging the complexity of human nature.
Yeah, he maintained that for sure. Building playhouse attendance certainly makes good business sense, and Will Shakespeare's astute business wisdom is what allowed him to buy the second largest house in Stratford and a great deal of land to fund his retirement.
Plays were not considered to have any staying power, like poetry or classic literature. So the unlikely possibility of future audiences would not seem to be a motivation. Would any of us think that YouTube or Vimeo scripts could be analyzed and discussed 400 years from now?
Boy, I wish this one would be discussed.
I don't think so.
Pierce could certainly have influenced Will Shakespeare, with a prime candidate being his good friend John Florio, whose stated goal was to elevate English culture closer to his prized Italian level.
Whatever his motivation, it appears we are far from done analyzing Will Shakespeare and his plays. And we want to thank you for indulging our passion by watching this video.
Yeah, if you have any comments or questions, please email them to bart4bard@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching.